Hello there. It's actually a really beautiful and sunny March 6th, 2012 out there. And for today's YouTube vlog, I decided to discuss a subject that I've danced and tiptoed around a lot on YouTube, but it's something that I felt the need to clear the air about right now and to set the record straight. Now, interspersed throughout my videos, if you've been watching them, there's been a lot of what I suppose could be interpreted as derogatory remarks or implied derogatory remarks about the 1990s and its effect on my personal life. This is something that I've discussed personally with many people I know, but I thought I want to offer my point of view since this is YouTube and there seems to be a place for almost any point of view here. So I wanted to provide one for you now. I've thought long and hard about how to present it, and the only way I can, because different times and different places mean something very, very different to each individual person. Then you have to really apply things to how they affected you personally in terms of a timeline. And that, in a word, is what I'm going to do. View the decade from the point of view of an outsider looking in, which is the best way to put in a nutshell how I felt during that time, rather than as an active participant, and put it on a distinct timeline from beginning to end. Now, I want to tell you right now, this might be one of the longer vlogs I've ever done because it is a broad subject matter. But I'll try to condense it as much as possible, and if I don't succeed, I'm very sorry, but it's best I can do. It's a very long story. I suppose it would all probably start, not in 1990, but in 1991. There was a war on. It was the Operation Desert Storm, and everybody was reasonably patriotic around me where I lived. Now, I must say that my own personal views on that are not really the subject for this situation. All I know is my primary interest was getting troops home and ending the war. I didn't want to see it continue. I had a family member over there. While a fairly distant one, it was still family, and I didn't want to see anything happen. And it didn't. In 1991, the war ended. I was out of 5th grade. Now, you know, when somebody is going from elementary school to junior high, I suppose their expectations are very intensely bright in a lot of ways, you know. In elementary school, you're always told to tolerate people telling you what to do. You're always told to tolerate bullying. I had a fair share of that, but basically there were pretty good times. I can't complain. Elementary school was not the worst time in my life. I mean, there were a lot of things I'd rather do different, but basically it was a pretty good time. Because I could deal with things pretty much culturally, you know. The books people read didn't offend me really that much, or didn't scare me. The music people listened to, I could kind of get with and dance to and sing with, or whatever it was. You know, I wasn't ever in with the in crowd, by any means. I never considered myself a huge conformist, but, hey, nothing anybody else was doing was upsetting me, and nothing I did really upset them. I'd say things were okay. Over the course of the summer of 1992, I was going into junior high the next year. I was a little nervous, I suppose, as most kids are. But, you know, my parents, especially my mother, kept telling me, you know, you're going to have a great time. It's totally going to change for you. You won't have to deal with bullying anymore. You won't have to deal with things that are unpleasant, really. You know, people will, you know, be more supportive of you. They'll consider you more mature and all of this. Well, around that time, my grandparents got cable, okay, and I was going up there to see it. Now, I've been so anxious about cable. I remember going over to friends' houses through the 80s and watching MTV when they had, you know, the Michael Jackson and Madonna and all of that, and dancing to those songs, you know, whatever. When they got MTV, I turned it on, and all I saw was this video with this blonde guy who hadn't combed his hair, who was screaming and yelping into a microphone, something about entertaining. And I learned the man's name was Kurt Cobain, and the song was called Smell Like Teen Spirit, and the group was called Nirvana. And I have to tell you, I didn't like the video or the song. It just was really ugly. I said, nah, well, once in a while we have ugly songs come along, but they kept playing this video over and over again. Every time I went up there, all I saw was Smells Like Teen Spirit, Smells Like Teen Spirit. I just couldn't get away from it. I thought, nah, I've seen videos played to death before. It's MTV after all. What's the big deal? They'll go on to something new. Well, by that time I was ready to go back to school. And I'm not going to be melodramatic about this, because this is absolutely true. When I first got to junior high, we'd go out on the front lawn of the school. The first day I was there. And honest to goodness, I felt like I was transplanted on some nightmarish other world. I'm serious. Everybody around me all of a sudden looked like the way Kurt Cobain had from that video. Everybody looked unwashed and dirty and unhappy. They were walking around with their face down like that, with their hair in front of their faces. You'd say hi, how are you to people. They didn't want to talk. I felt a little like, the way Michael J. Fox did in Back to the Future 2. There's a scene in that movie where some guy, his name is Biff, changes history, and he returns to his year, which is 1985, but he finds it a nightmare and is scared and doesn't recognize anything. Everybody is angry and hostile at each other. I felt like that. It was like a nightmarish version of the world. I said, what happened? Why is everybody acting like this? We hadn't even hit our teens yet. Well, things went on and on. Gradually, that negativity just sprang completely out of control in my life. For the first time, I encountered major bullying. I'm talking about, people threatening to meet me after school, which I never had before. People jumping out and lunging, and one man jumped out on top of me and tried to literally unscrew my head, tried to bang it against the ground to see if it would come off, I guess. I was screaming and everybody was laughing when it was happening. I went to the school board. The man in charge was an gym teacher. He was a vice principal. The real principal was off doing other things. We had to call him back to the school and identify these people, or this person that had done it, and we could never find it. Turned out he was the son of a maintenance man at our apartment, and the parents were kind of covering for him. Boys will be boys. I begged and I pleaded again and again and again to my parents, don't send me back to school. I'm only 12 years old. This is too big for me. For the first time in my life, this wonderful experience of junior high school was filling my life with sleepless nights and a fear that I just can't describe. When I go to my grandparents on MTV to try to get my mind off it and listen to music, which I loved, I always liked music of all sorts, pop or anything, all I would see again was that Kurt Cobain video and other videos that looked just like it, Pearl Jam. And then, when they'd have rap segments, and I've been listening to rap since the 80s, it was the same way with hip-hop. Everybody was saying mean things about everybody. They were calling women bad names. They were homophobic, and it was really, well, maybe MTV wasn't playing a lot of that, but you were hearing it on the radio. When a call would come by, you'd hear people using a lot of four-letter words and talking about people horribly and just being angry. And I said, whoa, let me out of this place. What happened? What happened to the world I was in? I said, let me tune into pop culture a little bit closer and see what's going on. So I did around 1993 and 4. By then I was doing homeschooling. I just couldn't stay in school anymore. My mother had actually had to make a huge sacrifice in her life to do this for me. But it worked, educationally. Socially, the problems that I had seen during 1992 were still very much the same. But at least now I started to understand why. And this is something I'm going to explain to you about how I felt about the 90s in general. I came to a conclusion when I was about 14 years old that the 1990s, fundamentally among all things, was somewhat like the 60s turned upside down. Now, in the 60s, there had been a conscientious movement of young people to rebel, as they say, against what had happened to them in the 1950s. The result was the counterculture of political activism on colleges and so on and so forth. But the overall flavor of that was infectious optimism. The overall flavor of the 90s was infectious pessimism and cynicism. Now, true, there were a lot of things about the 80s that the 90s era culture didn't like. But they didn't want to take the best philosophies, it seemed, from that decade in order to change or to grow. And I have to admit, I relate a lot more to the 80s, at least in my cultural context. For some others, it might have been a very frightening and unpleasant time. But in the 90s, it seemed like people were behaving in this dark and negative way just because they were so angry at what had happened in the 80s. It's a syndrome that I've actually given a name, like a disease, and I call it anti-80s-itis. That's what I call it today. But at the time, I didn't really have a name for it. I haven't seen this movie, but I've seen this quoted many times on YouTube, and it's kind of a random quote, and I'm sure out of context, but this epitomizes the time for me. And the line from this movie, New Jack City, was, if people don't learn to handle problems realistically, then every empty slogan or very special episode won't solve any problems. You'll notice a lot of kind of negative, pejorative words or whatever in that phrase. And the buzzwords started to really become very much that way too. In the 80s you had a lot of silly buzzwords, I suppose, but they were mostly infectiously positive. Radical, or rad, was one of them. And the words represented something that was kind of big and kind of exciting and kind of different and kind of new. The buzzwords of the 1990s, on the other hand, started to become words like realistic and conflict. These weren't very much of a buzzword to me. These were just kind of dark. And these were coming out of the mouths of kids who were my age, 13 and 14. I'm not sure how much a young person that age can really do with concepts like conflict and realistic in terms of their life. That's not something that a young child wants to think about. And basically what it comes down to is an attitude of forced fatalism. The media, obsessed with profane hip-hop, obsessed with grunge rock. It seemed like you couldn't really get on the radio. I'm serious. If you didn't have some sound that was a variation on what Ice Cube was doing or what Nirvana was doing, it seemed like that's all that was played. You turn radio dial one after the other. It was one song like this after the other. They called it alternative culture. The clothing got darker. I'd go past the school once in a while and I'd just see things get worse and worse and worse. And I just fell into this really heavy fear-based mentality where I would force myself to stay inside. I would only walk outside in alienated areas away from other people so I didn't have to be around it. As you can see, it's like today. I love wearing yellow shirts and having a lot of color in my life. I guess Rainbow Bright had some influence on me. I always thought the world needed color and some flair. And this was a culture that seemed to be anti all of that. So one day, my mother, observing my odd behavior, said that she'd got the song at the record stores on a little cassette single or casingle or whatever they call it now. And it was by a woman named Desiree, and I'm sure you've all heard this. It was called You Gotta Be. I'm not really singing well today, but the song was something like, listen as your day unfolds, challenge what the future holds, try to keep your head up to the sky, you gotta be tough, you gotta be, you know the song, anyway. And the main theme was that love will save the day. I actually smiled when I heard it. It would be, actually, almost more overplayed than Smells Like Teen Spirit had. But I didn't mind that. For once, there was something in society that seem to be, come on, let's get happy again. We're not going to be all realistic and conflicted anymore. It's not going to be this forced fatalism plague. It's funny. Teenagers in general are always expected to be a little bit mopey or a little bit unhappy. I was kind of told that getting into that age, but I had never seen anything like the kind of mopiness that I saw during that time. I was also losing a lot of friends. I couldn't culturally relate to them anymore. They were also moving off. And there was no internet, and certainly not in my life, at this time. So now we're up to about 1995 and 1996. I'm high school age. And I have responded to that by kind of inventing my own way of thinking. Everything was very infectiously positive in my life. Infectiously positive music, infectiously positive film. As a matter of fact, during that time, if I felt that a movie was too dark or had any of that forced fatalism attitude at a time where it was still very much in society, I figured, hey, Kurt Cobain is dead. Again, let's get happy here. I'd walk out. I didn't want to see it. That was, I guess, kind of my teenage rebellion. I wanted to be very positive and, understand the wonderful things around me and learn to live among them. And, I would not say that I was a bohemian or anything. I never, ever, ever used drugs of any sort. I still was very 1980s about that. I was avoiding those. But I became interested in, things that were, important for the mind. My interest in Star Trek continued, but I even noticed that began to become a little bit darker. Well, that I had trouble handling. As you know from previous vlogs, Star Trek was a source of great, spiritual enlightenment for me. I'll actually use those words, spiritual enlightenment. And to see it succumb to forced fatalism in the mid-1990s, with, darker movies and Deep Space Nine, a darker series, I didn't want to deal with that darkness at that time. So, not too long after that, some things came along in popular culture that I liked. But again, the pop culture was so downtrodden and so burdened down with realism and conflict, they couldn't see the good things about them. The Spice Girls, for example. They made some excellent, R&B, funky, dance-oriented music that had a lot of positive and empowering messages. And the pop press treated them as if they were the Monkees. I am serious. And worse, saying horrible things that, oh, well, they're no good. They did not get into the business organically. They were created by somebody. Here it was, 1994 all over again. Or 1993 all over again. Or 1992 all over again. And the Spice Girls disappeared from the radio and was back to, there was a song at the end of the 90s. Going into the 2000s. And when I heard it, I said, I'm an adult now. Why does it need to be back here? This is the story of a girl who cried a river and drowned the whole world. I said, 1993 is over. Why doesn't it end? Oh, goodness. So, by the time 2000 came along, I remember it was New Year's Day, and I don't know if it was cloudy or what, but I looked up to see if I could see any stars. And this may seem very theatrical, and I wondered, what are the 2000s going to bring? Is it going to be better than what I just went through? Well, as all of you know, if the 1990s was scary, or there was forced fatalism, there was very real fatalism and very real fear in the 2000s that we're still recovering from. And I think that to me is the fundamental problem with the 1990s. Things became so negative and cynical, and there was such a loss of well-rounded critical thought and positivity in that particular decade. That when 9/11 came along and there were real things to worry about and real things to be concerned, there just wasn't enough love and caring to really go around. The edginess and the cynicism that the 90s bought from the underground, and it existed before in the 70s and 80s in the underground, into the surface, has become the mainstream of our society today. And I think we're still picking up the pieces. To me, the 90s represents a lack of balance. And the one thing that I think ties all of this together, all of these difficulties I had in the 90s together, and I couldn't wait for the decade to be over, I have to tell you, with all the things I experienced. One thing, like I said, that really made the difference in the 90s to me is the decade's continual refusal, even today, or the people who were involved in that culture, to acknowledge the havoc they wrought. Everybody from the 1990s era pop culture thinks they did some kind of enormous good. They think they affected the world and made people more realistic and opened their eyes to things. All I see around me are people continually wrapped up in paranoid fantasies. I knew people who watched The X-Files and believed that the stories on that show were like from real government documents and those things were really happening, and people started acting like they were believing in shades and spirits and really kind of fetid superstitions, and the idea was that the darker you could get, the better it was. But I saw the other side of it. I got beaten up. People joined suicide cults. There were school shootings with children. People got killed. This wasn't Kent State with troops shooting at students. These were students shooting other students. They say you need a little darkness to make the light stand out. But I have one thing to say about the 1990s. In terms of the amount of darkness that was out there, I'm sorry. I gotta say, I think we get much too much. And I don't know what we can do to make things better now. It's so deeply rooted in society. All I can do is hope. I never want to have to feel, in the rest of the years I have in my life, that I have to hide away from society because it is so self-involved with forced fatalism. That's just my opinion. And such as it is, I welcome yours. Talk to you next time.